The operation to take control of the city of Raqqa, ISIS's largest stronghold in Syria, was one of the bloodiest assaults since the Syrian war started. It lasted about 4 months, I believe. ISIS controlled a large area of Syria, but they were being fought back by different factions like the Assad government and their allies like Russia and China and Iran, but also by the Kurds on the ground. By October 2017, ISIS had lost most of their land in Syria, and they'd basically been cornered into Raqqa, which was basically their capital in Syria. At that point, the Assad government and their allies decided that they needed to scale back their bombing campaign because Raqqa was so heavily populated with civilians. This doesn't mean that they're angels who have done their very best to avoid civilian casualties throughout this entire war. In fact, I think every actor involved with the Syrian conflict, or many different Syrian conflicts, I should say, have engaged in war crimes at some level. The Russian military, the Chinese military, the Syrian government, the Iranian military. They've all participated in the indiscriminate bombings that have killed scores of civilians. They had the common sense to realize that the amount of avoidable carnage and murder that they would have been responsible for had they gone into the city both barrels blazing might pass the threshold for what would be considered an acceptable amount of collateral damage. ISIS was basically holding the city and all of its civilians hostage. Imagine Bashar al-Assad and his allies are the police department called in to handle a hostage situation. Their approach was to figure out a way to get rid of ISIS with the least amount of civilian casualties, if for no other reason but to avoid the headlines that they just massacred an entire city. The Trump administration had no such restraint or consideration. The approach from the US government was, yeah, we'll get ISIS out of the city, even if we have to kill every goddamn civilian in the city. The US coalition unleashed a brutal air assault on the city of Raqqa. Air Wars and Amnesty International, as well as some other human rights organizations, tried to document what happened in that 4-month time period. Hospitals and civilian infrastructure was bombed intentionally. It was almost impossible to get food and medical supplies into the city. They were literally eating grass because there was no food in the markets. There weren't even any animals to hunt. Apartment buildings populated with civilians were bombed by the US with airstrikes. I can't remember if this was in Raqqa or in Mosul, but the US coalition was going after ISIS fighters on the ground, and the way it had been for weeks was, or the way it's been for months, is a lot of civilians will try to find shelter in the sturdiest building in the area. So you have your whole family and your neighbors and your friends in the basement, hoping that the building doesn't get struck by a drone or missiles. What the US would do is, say there was an ISIS sniper on the top of a building. Regardless of who's in that building, how many civilians are in that building, they would still call in an airstrike on that building, and there would be dozens, hundreds of people, civilians still in the building. It was dangerous to just walk the streets in the middle of the day, because if you were out by yourself or if you were with your family, there was a decent chance of you being spotted by a US drone, and that same drone turning around and dropping a bomb on you. When it was all said and done, 80% of the city was completely destroyed. 11,000 buildings. The detailed report from Amnesty International and Air Wars found at least 1,600 civilians were killed in the Battle over Raqqa. The civilian death toll that they calculated is 10 times higher than what the US military originally documented and reported. There's a bunch to say about this. First, can we finally acknowledge the fact that the US is notorious for covering up and lying about civilian casualties that we're responsible for? Every single operation or drone strike or war, you can rely on the US deliberately misreporting the civilian death tolls in epic ways. They did it in Fallujah and Mosul, Iraq. We're hearing now about how they're doing it in Syria. Right now, the US and Saudi Arabia are doing an assault on the port city of Hodeidah in Yemen that the UN warned could kill up to 250,000 civilians. You think when that's done, the US isn't going to fudge the numbers on the civilian death toll? In Vietnam, Cambodia, the Korean War, the government completely lied about what was going on and the civilian casualties and the fact that we were just burning down entire villages. In Iraq, human rights organizations have calculated the civilian death toll is around over 1 million, while the US government's official number is still around a couple thousand. These discrepancies aren't off by 1 death or 2 deaths. This specific story that I'm talking about, 10 times more civilian casualties than the US originally recorded. 10 times. And look, I get that we're talking about war and sometimes these things could be hard to exactly calculate because of the chaos, but it's just way past the point of absurdity now. Like I said, they're not off by 5 or 10 civilian casualties. We're talking about thousands of people. Furthermore, it's not really a coincidence. If you notice, they only ever err in the direction that makes them look good. Name me a time when the Pentagon released death tolls from some type of US action and their death toll was off by 1,000, 10,000 people. And their investigation showed that the US killed 1,000 more, 10,000 more civilians than how many actually died in the operation. That never happens. They only ever misreport numbers in the direction that makes them look good. Also, this isn't just some theoretical statistical hypothesis. Because of Chelsea Manning's leaks, we know the methodology used in any documentation or investigation of civilian casualties is intentionally biased. She showed that the way that they calculated civilian deaths in Iraq and Afghanistan was very strange. If you are a male between the ages of like 16 and 60, if the US military kills you in an airstrike or a drone strike or a raid, they will default classify you as an enemy combatant unless someone can prove otherwise that you were actually a civilian. That's an odd way to calculate civilian casualties. They have the burden of proof exactly backwards. If you're going to accuse somebody of something, you better have evidence and show proof beyond a reasonable doubt that, hey, this person is what I accuse them of. If you're going to accuse them of being a terrorist, you better prove that they're a terrorist. If you're going to accuse them of being an enemy combatant, you better prove how they were in combat with the US military or the US in general. But that's not how they do it. The way they do it, the way they calculate it is basically like this. Imagine you're taking a multiple choice test in a class and you have 4 options for every question, A, B, C, or D. But you wrote the test, you get to figure out how it's structured and graded. If you pick 3 out of the 4 options, you got that question right. You could never fail that test because it's set up in a way that makes it incredibly easy to look like you're getting all the right answers. If you're counting civilian casualties and you say that by default, at least 50 to 70% of the population of the country are enemy combatants and you don't need any further proof, obviously your count of civilian casualties will be a lot lower because the percentage of people that you consider to be civilians is incredibly small to begin with. If we want to be objective about this, the only logical conclusion that someone could come to is that there is a systemic, deliberate attempt by the US government to cover up war crimes and civilian casualties. If we lived in a sane world, this would be a story talked about nonstop by the mainstream media and independent media. And the Democrats would be demanding some type of investigation and accountability. But none of that is happening because this isn't as sexy as Russiagate. So almost everyone in media will ignore this. And of course, the Democratic Party is going to ignore this too. The next point I want to make is, what did you expect? We're talking about the Donald Trump presidency here. And of course, we get into the fact that the US military commits war crimes with impunity, and we have for decades. But the president, the commander-in-chief overseeing the Raqqa operation is Donald Trump. The same Donald Trump who campaigned on committing war crimes brazenly. He would say it in interviews, he would say it in debates, he'd say it in town halls, he'd say it in his rallies. He'd say shit like, we need to go into these countries and steal their natural resources to pay for these wars. That is a war crime. That is illegal under international law. And he was just saying that and getting applause lines. He was saying that he was going to bomb the civilians in Iraq and Afghanistan and Syria, and that he was going to deliberately kill the family members of ISIS fighters. So he was campaigning saying that he was going to target civilians. So now when he comes into office and drone strikes increase 430%, or civilian casualties are through the fucking roof, or we drop more bombs in Afghanistan in 2018 or 2017 than we did in the entire duration of this war that is now, I believe, 18 years old. Or when we get stories like this about the massacre in Raqqa, where thousands of civilians are killed, the entire city's destroyed. What did you think was going to happen? He said he was going to do this. So now that he did it, is anybody going to hold him accountable? Is anybody going to be calling for a special counsel or a special prosecutor to investigate the president for premeditated murder and war crimes? Because he specifically said he was going to kill the civilians on the ground in these countries as a fear tactic to get back at ISIS. So anybody investigating him for premeditated murder? No, they're not. And then one more point I want to make is, there are some times where the people who are trying to sheep herd voters into the Democratic Party or sheep herd people into voting for Hillary Clinton, there have been times where Donald Trump does some things and they say, oh, you see, Hillary Clinton wouldn't have done this though, but if Hillary Clinton was president, she wouldn't have done this. And there's some times where that is a valid point to make. Yeah, Hillary Clinton probably wouldn't got it out of the Paris Climate Accords. Hillary Clinton probably wouldn't have pulled out of the Iran nuclear deal. Probably. But here in Syria, Hillary Clinton was as hawkish as anyone. She was as adamant for escalating U.S. involvement in Syria. She was as adamant as anyone. She sounded just like a neocon. She wanted more U.S. troops in Syria. She wanted a no-fly zone in Syria. She threatened to shoot down Russian and Iranian jets for flying in Syria. Was on record boasting about how she wants to escalate the war. She wants more U.S. involvement, which would undoubtedly make the situation even more chaotic, and there would be even more civilian casualties. So when I hear stories like this, specifically in Syria, yeah, Donald Trump is a fucking butcher and he's a warmonger, and him and his defense secretary at the time, Jim Mattis, authorized the slaughter of thousands of civilians. Yeah, that's true. But Hillary Clinton would have done the same goddamn thing. Hillary Clinton, as hawkish as she is, as bloodthirsty and a bigger warmonger as she is, you think that if you would have put her in that exact situation where Donald Trump is, where he was, where you have ISIS beaten back, they are surrounded in Raqqa, and all you need is that final blow, and you could claim all the credit. You think Hillary Clinton would have said, you know what, let's talk about this diplomatically, let's all meet together at the UN and find some peaceful resolution to this. Let's have a dialogue and put it into this peacefully. If you're going to make that argument, you're incredibly fucking naive. Hillary Clinton would have went pedal to the metal. She would have annihilated the entire city just like Donald Trump did. And if you think she won't, she's the same person who lionizes Henry Kissinger. She makes Henry Kissinger out to be some type of elder statesman whose foreign policy decisions should be respected and learned from. Henry Kissinger was one of the chief architects for the Vietnam War, where we were just slaughtering civilians for no purpose at all. Henry Kissinger was the one who pushed the inhumane carpet bombing of Cambodia. Henry Kissinger egged on the burning down of villages and slaughtering civilians. That's who Hillary Clinton looks to. The same Hillary Clinton who voted for the Iraq War and pushed it endlessly. Same Hillary Clinton who voted for the Patriot Act. The same Hillary Clinton who, when she was Secretary of State, she pushed for the coup in Libya and the assassination of Gaddafi, which has thrown the country into chaos. That very same Hillary Clinton would have escalated in Syria as much as Donald Trump, if not more. So the problem is that needs to be addressed is both parties are incredibly hawkish. Both parties are full of more warmongers, and there is no real anti-war movement in Congress yet. Now we have some people like Tulsi Gabbard and Ro Khanna and Ilhan Omar and Bernie Sanders too, who are now making the case against interventionism, but both parties are still largely bought and paid for by the military-industrial complex, the banks and the defense contractors who profit from war. So we need to get money out of politics, private money out of politics, so we can end the culture of endless wars in the United States. But we also need to do serious war crimes investigations. And I don't know how many times I have to say this, probably till I'm blue in the face, because this likely will never happen. But how many times are we going to cover up the war crimes? How many times are we going to cover up the massacring of civilians? And again, I want to bring up that point that Kyle Kalinske makes about civilian casualties. Maybe the first time you slaughter civilians, it was an accident, but when you do the same thing every single day of the week, it's hard for me to believe you when you say it's an accident, because you aren't doing anything to prevent it, and you aren't doing anything to hold anyone accountable when it does happen. So the very same thing, so I believe that very same rule applies with the misreporting and deliberate lying when it comes to civilian casualties. Maybe it was an accident the first time, or the first war, or the first operation, but when it happens on a regular basis, on a consistent basis, when you can set your clock by the US lying about civilian death tolls, that's a problem.